Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Kat West. I am friends and colleagues with your professor, Professor Lynch, and she has asked me to talk to you guys today a little bit about the biology of behavior. My background is in medical neuroscience. I went to the Medical University of South Carolina and earned a PhD in neuroscience. Hopefully you remember what that was, which branch of psychology that was from the first couple lectures. But what I'm going to talk to you today about is the actual structures that are within your body, within your nervous system, that allow it to do what it does. So we're going to do this in two parts. This first one is going to be about some of the biology, some of the physical parts, and then we'll look at some other things that are related. And hopefully by the end of this, I will have been able to answer all of your questions about what's going on and what makes up your nervous system and what it's up to. So the first thing that I want to sort of talk about is, again, when you were reviewing this with Dr. Lynch in chapter 1, you talked about neuroscience. Another name for that would be a biological psychologist. And basically what we do, what I did in graduate school, is looking at how there's this relationship between how the things that are happening biologically in your body relate to psychological phenomenon. So if you remember, biological things could be genetics, neural things, hormonal things like that, and how that relates to various psychological processes, things like learning or stress or memory or something to that effect. Particularly in graduate school, my particular project was looking at the processes of drug addiction and drug abuse. So I did some really interesting and crazy things. I got mice drunk and we looked at the effects of alcohol and alcohol withdrawal. I gave cocaine to rats and we looked at some of the effects and what was going on there with cocaine use, with cocaine abuse, with cocaine withdrawal and treatment options. So again, what I was looking at is the biology of what changes in the brain and in the nervous system when someone is actually addicted to a chemical substance, and then how that relates to psychological things like addiction, craving, relapse, that sort of thing. So that's what a biological psychologist does. We do know that our brain is sculpted by our genetics, so your genetics are important. They can help determine particular characteristics, particular things that you do, for example, how much of a particular neurotransmitter level you make, for example. But your brain is also heavily sculpted by the things you encounter in life. Your brain is what we call plastic. Some say it is, another term for that could be neuroplasticity. And basically what that just means is that your brain has the ability to change as the environment changes and as you change. So if you experience a very heavy stress period, for example, your brain will rewire and change what it does. As you learn and as you grow and as you read and as you gain more knowledge, your brain will change to incorporate all of that. If you train yourself to do some sort of physical activity, so we see this a lot with athletes that train for their particular sport over and over and over and over again, your brain will rewire to totally make that process happen better and more effectively. This is what is meant by neuroplasticity. Your brain has the ability to change and regroup itself. It can reorganize after damage. It can build new pathways based on experiences. So for example, I was telling you with the athletes, so your brain has a lot of pretty cool stuff that it's able to do, and so it's not just the genetics that you got. That's only one piece. The other piece of the puzzle is what's happened to you in your life and what you have tried to do. In other words, sort of your environment that allows your brain to be as cool as it is. So before we talk about the brain as a whole, we're going to start really, really small. We're going to talk about the individual cells in your brain. Now, there are two main types of cells in your brain. There are cells called neurons, and there are cells called glial cells. For this class, we're really just going to focus on the neurons, because the neurons are the ones that are doing the majority of the cool stuff that we think about when we think about what your brain does. So the brain sending messages all over the body to various parts of your body, or your brain bringing in information from your sensory systems. That's where your neurons come in. So neurons are just specialized cells, and just like any other part of the body, those cells do certain things and they have certain parts. So for example, they have a big cell body. Now the fancy word for this is soma, but you can just remember this is a big cell body. And just like any other cell in your body, it's also got a nucleus that contains the genetic information within it. And then it's got all those other parts that it would normally have. So it has things like ribosomes and mitochondria and all those sorts of things. But what makes neurons special are a couple unique parts that other cells don't have. The first one of those unique parts sort of looks like these little finger extensions. Some other people call them tree-like branches maybe that come off of the cell body, and those are called dendrites. I think of dendrites sort of like a baseball player or a softball player has a glove. They spread themselves out so that it's easier to catch the ball as the ball is coming towards you. Or if you think about a basketball player and what they're told when they're going to go to catch the ball, they're told to spread their fingers so that they have a bigger ability to catch the ball easier. You wouldn't want to keep your fingers closed like this. You'd want to spread them out so that it's easier to catch the message. And that's exactly what the dendrites are doing. The dendrites are catching or receiving messages, primarily from other cells. But when we talk sensory systems later on, you're going to find out that there are specialized dendrites within the sensory systems that can detect other kinds of information. So for example, the sensory cells that are in your eye have specialized dendrites that interact with the light that comes into your eye and catches that light and turns it into neural energy. So that's the job of the dendrite, is to catch stuff, right? And it's catching typically message that's coming from another cell. Now, once there has been enough message, once there has been enough excitation coming in, your neuron will reach something called threshold, which means it's got enough excitatory information where it says, you know what, I need to pass this message on. And it will pass the message on down this really long, thin structure called an axon. Now, axons can be a variety of lengths. They can be super teeny tiny. So for example, you have some neurons in your spinal cord that have these teeny tiny little axons. You also have axons that are huge. So you have some axons that come out of your spinal cord and go all the way down your leg to some of the muscles in the lower part of your leg. So axons can be really long or really short. But the way I think about axons is axons are kind of like a cord, right? They're kind of like a cord, and what they're transmitting is electrical message. So what's underneath this cord that I'm holding here, all right, would be electrical message. And it's that electricity that travels quickly down that cord to the end, and the end of the axon sometimes has a bunch of names depending on which textbook or who you're talking to. This book calls it the terminal branches of the axon. So these are the terminal branches, so that electrical energy travels all the way down the axon and it reaches the terminal branches. All right, that pulse of electricity that shoots down the axon to reach the terminal branches is called a neural impulse. It's also called an action potential, and that's the word that I'm going to use the most, is action potential. But that's really what it is. It's just a neural impulse of electricity, electrical energy that zooms down the length of the axon to the terminal branches. The last part that's really specialized, right, on this neuron is very similar to this wire that I've got here. If the wire wasn't covered with this rubbery plastic stuff, what do you think would happen? Well, what would happen is that the underlying wire, which in this case would be metal underneath there, all right, if I touched it and it was plugged in, I'd get shocked. In other words, the electrical energy would go away from the wire and into my hand, and that would be a very unpleasant experience. So what happens, and the reason we coat all of our wires with something that's rubbery or plasticky like this, right, is to protect that electrical energy and keep it within, all right, the electrical structure that's underneath, the metal structure that's underneath. It also helps keep this cord from getting damaged, all right, and it speeds it up so the electricity that's flowing through this cord does so faster. Your body has a very similar system built into it, and we call that the myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath is this fatty structure, right? It's made from that other type of cells that I was telling you about called glial cells, but those glial cells wrap that fatty structure all along the myelin, basically coating it just like you would coat a wire, right? That's going to contain electricity. That speeds up the electrical message, that speeds up the action potential. That electrical impulse is traveling down. It protects the axon and keeps it so it doesn't get damaged. So it's just really, really important. So those are some special parts that you're going to need to know about a neuron. You're going to need to know that the dendrites receive and catch message. You're going to need to know that the axon transmits an action potential down the length of it towards the terminal branches. And again, what will happen then at the terminal branches is these terminal branches will pass the message on to the next neuron. So in other words, to the dendrites of the next neuron. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. So related to all of this, all right, here are some things that I was just telling you about. So the job of neurons are to transmit messages when they are stimulated either by our senses or by neighboring neurons. And if you need to pause this screen and write some of this down, you absolutely can. Feel free to do that. But this is the stuff that I was talking about on the last screen. If there is enough incoming message and that incoming message excites the neurons, excites those dendrites in the cell body enough, that neuron will send a message down the length of the axon. It's called firing an impulse, right? And that action is called the action potential. An action potential is a brief electrical charge. Again, it travels down the length of the axon towards the terminal branches of the axon. And again, it's basically an electrical charge. Right? It's generated from a series of chemical events and ions that are exchanged. You can learn about that in a future class if you want. I'm going to show you a slide that sort of briefly shows it, but you don't need to necessarily have that part memorized. But just know that how that electricity is generated is through a series of ion changes. And what those dendrites, if you remember the dendrites were catching message, what they are constantly catching is both inhibitory and excitatory signals. If they catch an inhibitory signal, it means it's less likely to send an action potential. In other words, less likely to pass that message on. If it catches excitatory signal, that makes it more likely to send that action potential on. So it's constantly sort of balancing incoming excitatory message and incoming inhibitory message. If there is enough excitatory message, the neuron is said to have reached threshold. And if it reaches threshold, it will send an action potential down the length of the axon to the terminal branches. Once it has done so, all right, there is a brief, what we call refractory period. And I'll explain that a little bit more on the next slide, but the refractory period is just this slight pause in time where the neuron can't produce another action potential just because it basically needs to reset itself and get ready to set it again. Also, an action potential is an all or none response. This means if an action potential starts in the axon, it will travel the entire length. It's not like it can only travel halfway and then stop. If there is enough excitatory message, and if you reach threshold, that action potential will start and it will go the entire way down the length of the axon. So it's all or none. It's either going to go or it's not going to go. So taking a closer look at it, here's sort of what I meant before by, again, a series of ion changes. The two particular ions that are important are sodium and potassium. They are being actively kept in certain places related to the axon. And basically what happens is your neuron is constantly sitting at this happy negative 70 millivolts. Millivolts is a measurement of electrical charge. This is what I mean when I say there's an electrical charge traveling down the axon. It's sitting there all nice and happy, ready to go. If there's enough incoming stimulation, you can see here this represents incoming stimulation. In other words, the dendrites have caught excitatory message, right? It will trigger an action potential. So again, if you get enough and you reach threshold, an action potential will occur. What's going to happen very quickly is that the sodium and the potassium ions are going to quickly change places, and it's going to cause this huge spike in charge and then a huge decrease in charge, and then the neuron will then get itself reset back to that resting potential. And it's this resetting part that causes what I talked about before, right, which is that refractory period. So it does sort of have to recompensate for itself. But this whole process is called an action potential. And neurons are really good and really fast at doing these action potentials and getting reset to be able to transmit another one. This is why our neurons can very quickly send messages all around your body to various muscles, to various glands. Within the brain itself, it can send messages back and forth between different brain regions. And this is how your cells of your nervous system communicate with one another. A little bit more about what I've been talking about written, and again, if you need to pause this slide, you are welcome to. The action potential travels down and it reaches the axon's end, which is called the terminal branches. When it gets there, if you think about it, all right, I'm going to skip ahead to something else that's written here. The two neurons that communicate with each other, so the terminal branches of one neuron, right, are going to be near and close to the dendrites of a second neuron. What's going to happen, though, right, is that they don't physically touch each other. There's a little bit of space there, right? And that space is called a synapse or a synaptic gap. And if you think about it, if we're sending electricity down the axon, if that electricity gets to the end and you had to shoot that electricity across to the neighboring dendrite, what would that look like? Well, here's how I want you to think about it. Think about what it might look like if you have a cloud here and a cloud here in the sky and they shoot electricity to each other. Well, that looks like lightning. In fact, that's what it is when we're talking clouds. Well, we don't want something that's like lightning shooting around in our brain. Yes, electricity travels down a cord, especially a cord that's wrapped in myelin sheath, very efficiently. But electricity doesn't shoot across open spaces very efficiently at all. In fact, it spreads out, which is what makes it look like lightning. So our neurons actually have two ways of sending that message. Down the length of the axon is the action potential. That's the electrical part. But from the end, from the terminal branches to the next dendrite, all right, we don't send the electrical charge. We use the second thing that we have, which is a chemical messenger. And those chemical messengers are called neurotransmitters. So what happens is the terminal branches, the electrical part reaches the terminal branches. That triggers the release of those neurotransmitters into the space, so into the synaptic gap. And those dendrites have special receptors on them that catch, that's what I meant by they catch stuff, that catch those neurotransmitters. And then those neurotransmitters, when they're caught, will either excite that next neuron or inhibit that next neuron. So the neurotransmitters are going to bind to receptors on the receiving neuron, so on those dendrites of the receiving neuron. And then once they're done, once they've been caught, several things can happen. They can either be reabsorbed, so the terminal branches that sent the neurotransmitter can suck it back up, and we call that reuptake. We're not super creative, but we name things, so it takes it back up. Or the neurotransmitter can just kind of drift away and be dissolved, or it can be broken down right there in that gap, in the synaptic gap, by various enzymes so that it can no longer excite or inhibit the dendrite. And then that process cleans up the synapse so that the next time an action potential comes down and new neurotransmitter is released, that dendrite is ready to catch again. So hopefully that process makes a little bit of sense. I'm going to show it to you again sort of in two ways. Here it is first in picture form. So I've got a neuron here. I've got all the dendrites. I've got the cell body. Let's say there was enough stimulation, we reached threshold. The electrical action potential is going to get sent down the length of the axon to the terminal branches. Now let's zoom in a little bit. So here's just the end of one terminal branch. And as you can see, it doesn't actually touch the dendrite. There's a tiny space, a synaptic gap between the two of them. So when the electricity comes racing down, that triggers the release of these neurotransmitters, which are being stored in these little bubbles, all right, these little vesicles right here. The neurotransmitter spills out, activates receptors on the catching dendrite, and either excites it or inhibits it. And then once it's done that, it's either sucked back up in a process called reuptake. It either gets dissolved or eaten up by enzymes, or it just kind of dissolves and floats away. And then the synapse is cleared out again for the next time. All right, now keep in mind, I am not a good animator, but this is sort of what it looks like. Go with it for just a minute. Here we go. I've got two neurons here. So here's neuron number one. These little squiggly things are supposed to represent dendrites. This is the big cell body. Here's an axon. Here are the terminal branches. Here's a second neuron with its set of dendrites, these little squiggly things, a second axon. So here's what happens. All right, if the first neuron, right, is stimulated, so in other words, it catches a little bit of neurotransmitter, right, it will cause a reaction, but it wasn't enough to reach threshold, so nothing really occurs. But if there is enough stimulation and we do reach threshold, now that action potential, that electrical current, is going to travel down the length of the axon and gets to the end. But notice when it got to the end, we didn't shoot electricity across, because shooting electricity like this would be a horrible idea. Instead, what was released, and that's what's represented by these little white dots, are neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitter shoots, floats across, interacts with the receptors, and then again is either taken back up or dissolves away and is gotten rid of. So let's watch it again. Let's go back and watch it one more time. Again, a little bit of stimulation doesn't do anything, but a lot of stimulation will cause the action potential because you reach threshold. It's traveling down the length of the axon. When it gets to the end, neurotransmitter spills out to then stimulate the next neuron. Does that make sense? Hopefully that process makes sense. There are a couple neurons that I think you should know, not neurons, a couple neurotransmitters that I think you should know because they either have cool stories or because they're doing really cool things in your body. So I've given you 6 here that I think would be helpful for you to know. I've given you the major functions of each, and I've given you some examples of what can go wrong if you don't have the proper level of these neurotransmitters in your nervous system. And I'm going to talk through a few of them. The first one I'm going to start with is acetylcholine. The biggest place that acetylcholine is used is actually for your muscles. So when your motor neurons, you'll hear about those later, stimulate a muscle. So if I want to make my arm move or if I want to make my fingers move, I had to actually send an action potential down the length of an axon, right, to the terminal branches, and the terminal branches spilled out acetylcholine onto the muscles in my hand or in my arm so that I could make that muscle contract and I could move it the way I wanted to move it. Acetylcholine is also important for learning and for memory. It's affected significantly in somebody that has Alzheimer's disease, for example. But the reason this is such a neat story, acetylcholine, is because of how it was discovered. It was actually the first neurotransmitter that was discovered. Before this, we didn't quite know how it worked. We knew that there were neurons. We could see those because we had a microscope ability to see those, but we didn't have a microscope enough of ability to see the actual neurotransmitters. So we didn't quite know how neurons worked. We knew it had some sort of electrical component because I could actually stimulate with real electricity a neuron and I would cause it to do something. So we knew that there was some sort of electrical component to it, but we didn't know what the rest of the story was. And so sort of by accident, a researcher named Dr. Otto Lowy was able to figure out what acetylcholine did. Again, I say it was by accident because he wasn't trying to discover neurotransmitters. What he was trying to understand is how the vagus nerve that runs down here stimulates your heart and makes your heart beat. And so what he was using was actually frog hearts. So he would dissect the frog heart and the vagus nerve from a frog, and he found that there was a special fluid that he could put it in, basically a salt solution that he could put it in. He could manually stimulate, all right, the vagus nerve, and it would cause the frog's heart to beat. So what he was trying to understand is what exactly is that process? How does a beating heart work? So he would do that. He would take out the heart, he would take out the vagus nerve, he would stimulate it, the heart would beat. All right, and then he eventually, because the heart is no longer in the frog, the tissue would eventually die, so he'd have to get rid of that one and get a new frog heart. Well, he was doing that one day. He was doing his experiments. He would work with one heart, he would get all the data he was going to get. That heart would then no longer work, so he went to get a new heart. So he got the new heart and the new nerve out of the frog. He put it into the solution, and before he even had a chance to stimulate the vagus nerve, the heart started beating. And he was like, well, that's weird. I didn't actually apply the electricity yet, so there's no reason that heart should be beating unless the previous heart right, or the previous vagus nerve released some sort of chemical into the water, into the solution that's now interacting with this new heart. And he said, all right, I'm going to test that. I'm going to see if there's some sort of chemical. So what he did is he took a brand new heart, brand new solution, and he got 2 containers this time that were connected to each other so that only the fluid, only the liquid could go back and forth. The heart itself couldn't touch each other. And he put one frog heart with the nerve in this side, and he put another frog heart in the other side. He stimulated the heart, so it started beating. And again, if it was due to a chemical, eventually that chemical would be released, it would float through the liquid, and it would cause this one to beat. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. So he stimulates this one, it starts to beat, and then after a few seconds later, so did this one. And this was the first way they discovered that it's actually not just an electrical process, it's also a chemical process. Now, fast forward a whole bunch of years and a whole bunch more research later, and chemists as well were also able to help us identify that the specific chemical that we were talking about for this muscle, because your heart is a big muscle, is acetylcholine. So that's how we discovered acetylcholine. And then once we realized, oh, there's chemicals involved, then we started to go look for them, and we found a whole bunch of others. Now again, this chart is not all of the different neurotransmitters that there are. These are probably just some of the either most well-known or well-studied, or they're the ones that are going to have functions that are very obvious to you. So hopefully you will remember them. So acetylcholine, as I said, muscle action, as well as learning and memory. A lot of people know what dopamine is, even if they don't, because they've heard of a disease called Parkinson's disease. So when dopamine neurons in a particular part of the brain get damaged and no longer work, a person ends up experiencing Parkinson's disease. And if you think about what the symptoms of that would be, it's very rigid movements or shaky movements. You can't control yourself very well. Well, that's how we learned, well, that must be what dopamine is up to. One of the things that dopamine does is influencing your ability to move. Another thing that we found is that patients with schizophrenia had too much dopamine in the frontal lobe of their brain. So they had very weird ability to pay attention. They would have these really erratic moods, particularly inappropriate emotional responses. And then what we've also learned is that individuals that use way too much cocaine, which also floods the front of your brain with dopamine, can cause somebody to have almost like a schizophrenic-like state. So this is what led us to discover, that must be what dopamine does. Dopamine must have in one part of the brain a responsibility to help with movement, but then in other parts of the brain, for example, like the frontal lobe, it must help with things like learning, paying attention, emotional expression, that sort of thing. A lot of people have also heard of serotonin. Individuals that are diagnosed with depression are sometimes given antidepressant medication. Prozac is an example of that. Antidepressant medications serve to increase the amount of dopamine. So one of the things that we see in some patients with depression is they have too little dopamine. They don't have enough, I'm talking serotonin. They don't have enough serotonin in their nervous system. So what the antidepressants do is help raise the level of serotonin. So that was one of the things that we learned that serotonin does, is that it affects your mood. Some other symptoms of individuals that are depressed, they usually have disrupted hunger. They either feel hungry all the time or they don't ever feel hungry. They have problems with sleep. Either they can't get to sleep or they want to stay asleep more than they should. They have arousal problems. They just can't pay attention very well. They just don't feel right. And that's how we learn sort of the function of serotonin. Serotonin is important for mood. It's important for hunger behavior, sleeping, arousal, and all of those will get disrupted if you had disrupted levels of serotonin. Similarly, norepinephrine is actually a new chemical that we have found sometimes is related to depression as well, and some new drugs actually target both serotonin and norepinephrine and try to raise the alerts. But you also need epinephrine in general to help control the amount of alertness you feel as well as your amount of arousal. So if you're going to be paying attention and focused on something, you need the proper level of norepinephrine. I'm going to skip GABA just for a minute and come back to it. I'm going to skip to the end, which is glutamate. Glutamate is a major excitatory neurotransmitter. It's probably the most prevalent in the most parts of your brain. I mean, the others are very important, but glutamate is found almost everywhere, and it's heavily involved with memory. So you need important parts of your brain to have proper levels of glutamate to have proper memory production. One of the problems, though, with glutamate is that during seizures, so anybody that would have a seizure actually emit too much glutamate. The neurons just start purposefully pumping out glutamate because they're not quite sure what's happening during the seizure, and that actually irritates it and can worsen the seizure. We think for some people this is what also can produce migraines. This is why some people are allergic to MSG. If you've ever heard of that in food, that stands for monosodium glutamate. So some people are very sensitive to that. But again, glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, and it is definitely needed in your brain, particularly for memory function. Now, the reason I skipped GABA is because all the others that I told you about, acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and glutamate, all of those are excitatory. So when they are received and caught by a dendrite, they will excite the neuron. GABA is the only one that we are going to discuss that is inhibitory, and that's really what I want you to remember about it. GABA stands for gamma aminobutyric acid. Pretty much no one ever calls it that. We always call it by the abbreviated name GABA, and that's what you would need to remember. Again, it's a major inhibitory neurotransmitter. If you don't have enough of it, you can have seizures, tremors, insomnia. But the way I like to think about it and think about what GABA does to your body is by thinking about what would happen to a person if they consumed too much alcohol. So I know none of you have ever done this, but maybe you know somebody that has. Think about somebody that has consumed too much alcohol. What are some of their symptoms? Well, they probably slur their speech. They probably have trouble moving around and they kind of flop over. They might even fall completely over. And if they have way too much, they actually pass out or black out. Well, that's why that happens, is because alcohol actually acts like artificial GABA in your system. It inhibits your nervous system, which is why you don't speak right, because all the nervous system neurons aren't sending the message properly to the muscles in your throat and in your mouth to make you say the words correctly. It's why you might fall over, because you're not getting proper stimulation. It's why you'll pass out eventually, because your brain will just go, okay, too much. I am too inhibited. If I get any more inhibited, I'm not going to keep the lungs and the heart going, which is dangerous. So I'm going to make you just pass out so you'll stop drinking. All right? That's the role of GABA. Now, normally we don't have that high level of GABA in our body. We have a smaller amount of GABA that just helps regulate, all right, proper functioning of the body so that it doesn't ever get too excited. It can sort of be a balance to some of the excitation. But again, if somebody is drinking alcohol and putting artificial GABA into their body, it can get to be excessive. So hopefully those make sense. Hopefully you took some good notes on those different kinds of neurotransmitters. We've got a little bit more in this lecture, so let's sort of go back to the idea of the neurons now. So neurons can work individually or they can work together in bundles. A bundle of neurons working together is called a nerve. So if you've ever said, for example, oh, I pinched a nerve in my neck, what you're basically saying is actually you pinched a whole bunch of axons, so a bundle of axons that was come together. And usually that bundle of axons is carrying a message either to your brain or away from your brain out towards a muscle. That being said, that's what leads us to this idea that there are three primary types of neurons in your nervous system. The first one would be your sensory neurons. And again, we are not creative. So the job of these sensory neurons is to bring in sensory information. So your sensory neurons are located, for example, in your eyes to bring in visual information, in your ears to bring in auditory information, on your tongue to take in chemical information about the food and stuff that you put in your mouth. You've got some in your nose. You've got some all over your skin. In other words, sensory neurons are detecting stuff from your sensory organs and then sending that information to the brain so the brain can process it. That's the job of sensory neurons. Again, we're not creative. Motor neurons help you move. So the motor neurons are sent out from the brain and from the spinal cord, and they interact with various muscles, and they stimulate the muscles, and they make those muscles contract so that you can move your body around. All right, so the job of sensory neurons is to bring in sensory information. The job of motor neurons is to send out movement information so that your muscles contract and help you to move. And then you have a third type, which are called interneurons. And interneurons are what I like to think of as inside the nervous system. And interneurons are sending messages to and from various parts of the brain. You've got some interneurons in the spinal cord that are helping send messages within the spinal cord. So interneurons are what's helping connect all of the rest of your nervous system together. So if you think about it as like a pathway, so if you ever gotten scared, and I'll give you an example. I was walking my dog one night. It was pretty close to 4th of July, and I was walking around the neighborhood, no big deal like I normally do, but all of a sudden one of my neighbors let off some firecrackers. And of course, I had no idea they were going to do this, neither did my dog. And so the two of us, I screamed, he ran, and I jumped up in the air and let go of the leash. And of course, my dog ran home. Luckily, he was smart enough to run home and not away. But again, what happened then is that immediately my sensory neurons took in that information of the bang, 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 bang from the firecrackers, right? And an interneuron in my spinal cord immediately caused me to let go, all right, of the leash by quickly sending a message to a motor neuron, which sent a message to the muscles, which made me let it go. So some interneurons are really teeny tiny and can quickly help you with reflexes like that of, ah, as I screamed. Right? Then there was a second set of interneurons. Once the sensory information got to the brain and said, hey, there was something very scary, right? Those interneurons in my brain started going, okay, what could that be? Was that a gunshot? What was that? And I was able to eventually calm myself down and go, okay, that sounded more like fireworks than a gunshot. It is close to 4th of July. That was probably fireworks. All that's interneuron happening within my brain. So eventually my interneurons were then able to send new messages via my motor system that said, okay, calm yourself back down, walk towards your house, or in my case, run towards your house, and go look for your dog and make sure your dog is okay. Right? So the job of the interneurons is sort of kind of be the relay system, not just between the sensory incoming information and the motor outgoing information, but even within your brain. For example, as I was processing the information of what in the world was that I just heard. A couple other things we're going to talk about. So we're sort of backing out here, right? We started really teeny tiny with the nerves, and now we're sort of going global here. You've got two major parts of your nervous system. Your nervous system as a whole is made up of the peripheral system and the central nervous system. The job of the peripheral nervous system is to gather information and then to transmit information. So as you might imagine, the sensory neurons that are bringing in the sensory information are part of the peripheral system. And the motor neurons that are taking that information about movements that you want to make and sending it to the muscles are all part of the peripheral system. The central nervous system, right, is the body's decision maker, and the interneurons make up the largest chunk of the central nervous system. So if you look at it sort of in picture form, you've got an entire nervous system. Again, it's divided into peripheral and central. The central nervous system is exclusively made up of the brain and the spinal cord, so brain and spinal cord. And then everything else, so all the incoming sensory information, and then all the outgoing motor information makes up the peripheral system. Now the peripheral system is also further divided into an autonomic and somatic system, as well as those are further divided. The somatic nervous system is related to some of your sensory input as well as your motor output, and your autonomic functions are related into your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. So I'm going to go over these and then I will show you some more definitions in the slides. So autonomic sounds like the word automatic, and that's how I remember it. Autonomic, that part of your nervous system controls things that happen automatically. For example, your heart beating, right? Your heart beats automatically. It is automatically sent messages that keep it beating. You don't have to consciously think about, okay, I need my heart to beat now, and now, and now, and now, and now. Because if you had to consciously think about that, right, you wouldn't be able to do anything else. Or if you did have to consciously think about it and you did think about something else and stopped reminding your muscle to beat, your heart would stop beating and you would die. So it's a very good thing that we have an autonomic system that is kind of unconsciously, automatically making things happen. Breathing is another one. Right? Now, I can override it and I can purposefully make myself breathe. Like I can take a good deep breath. I can do that on purpose. I could hold my breath on purpose. But if I stop thinking about breathing, right, the autonomic system will kick back in and it will keep me breathing so that I don't have to consciously think about it if I don't want to. Another example would be digestion, right? As food is moving through your intestines are squeezing and moving and mashing up all that food and moving it around. Luckily, you don't have to consciously think about that, because if you did, it would be like the weirdest dance ever to purposefully try to get the muscles to move the food around your body, and that's just weird. Nobody wants to do that. So that's the autonomic system. Now let's go back to the example I was just talking about with my dog and walking my dog with the firecrackers. All right. Another thing, and again, this is part of your autonomic system, it sort of has these two competing systems to keep you at the proper level of arousal. It's called the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. And again, they kind of work like a balance. All right? If needed, your sympathetic nervous system can get you excited and aroused so that you pay attention. So particularly when things are dangerous, for example, you want to be able to pay attention. All right, and that was the case when those firecrackers startled me. Actually, same thing for my dog too. His sympathetic system went crazy as well and got us both ready. Like, what was that? Are we in danger? All right. But luckily, I didn't have to spend the rest of my life freaked out and paranoid about the sound of those firecrackers. I was able to eventually calm down and go, okay, that was just firecrackers. I am not hurt. Once I found my dog, I was able to go, okay, my dog is not hurt. We were then able to go home. We were able to go to sleep later that night. So we were able to calm ourselves back down, even though we had been very excited. Both of those things sort of happened automatically. We got scared and aroused automatically, and then we calmed back down automatically. Again, thanks to the autonomic nervous system. The other system that's part of the peripheral system is the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is taking into account all of either the stuff that you feel, so the incoming sensory input, as well as the motor output when you purposefully want to make yourself move. So if I purposefully wanted to take my finger and touch my nose, right, it would be my somatic system that is sending those motor impulses, thanks to my motor neurons, to the muscles in my arm that are allowing me to move the way I want to move. So that's the somatic system. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Again, here are the definitions. I highly suggest that you pause on these slides and sort of write this down, but this is what I just told you about. Peripheral system is made up of a somatic system as well as an autonomic system. So again, pause and make sure you get this down. And then besides this, the somatic system and the autonomic system is also further divided up into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. And this is how it was able to get my body aroused or relaxed, right? Because it interacted, it sent messages to a whole lot of my other organ systems. So when I got scared, my heart started beating really fast, right? For example, all right? So that's because my sympathetic nervous system was getting me ready in case I needed to run and get away from whatever the danger was. And then again, later on, when I was able to calm down, thanks to my parasympathetic system, right, my heart was also able to slow back down. But it's not just the heart. The sympathetic system will change the way your pupils work, will change the way your digestion works, the hormones that are released by your liver, all kinds of things like that. So again, sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are working kind of in a balance. So if you need to, again, pause here and make sure you have this information. I already said this, so again, if you want to just pause and write this down, you can, but this is what your central nervous system is, sort of written out in word form. So the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. So again, you're going to want to make sure you pause here and get this information. And then finally, what I want to talk about is the endocrine system. And I sort of already mentioned it earlier when I was talking about when I got scared, right? And I was talking about how my heart started beating really fast, right? And all of this information was sent to all these other organs of my body. The endocrine system is a separate entire system from your nervous system. But I like to think of it as almost like the best friend of the nervous system. So the nervous system and the endocrine system are like BFFs. They often work together to help keep your body at exactly what it needs to be, at the proper level of arousal, at the proper temperature, so that you have the right amount of sugar in your bloodstream so that you don't have too much or too little. If you get hot, it will help you sweat so that you cool off. So your endocrine system and your nervous system are constantly working together to make sure your body is protected and is what it needs to be. Your nervous system, and this is what we already talked about, uses neurotransmitters, all right, and uses that electrical action potential to send those messages. And sometimes it's sending those messages to a muscle, but other times it's sending those messages to a gland. And those glands are what are part of the endocrine system, and the glands are secreting hormones. Hormones are also chemical messengers, but instead of being in your nervous system, the endocrine system releases hormones into the bloodstream, and then they can circulate around to wherever they need to go. So the hormones are also a chemical communication system. The example that I gave you earlier of me getting scared by the firecrackers with my dog, again, what happened immediately was like and I screamed and I let go of the leash, but then almost right after that, like a couple seconds after that, I felt my heart start to race, right? Because I'd had this huge adrenaline rush. Well, what had happened is that my nervous system had sent my endocrine system, specifically my adrenal gland, a message saying, "We are in danger, help us out." And my adrenal gland released something called adrenaline. Sometimes it's called epinephrine. And that adrenaline then rushed through my bloodstream and went to a lot of places in my body, but one of the places it went to was also my heart to help speed it up. All right. And that's how I felt that adrenaline rush. So again, that's that nervous system, endocrine system, best friend relationship. Another part of the endocrine system is also called the pituitary gland. It's located right up underneath your brain. Sometimes it's called the master gland. It tends to get a lot of information directly from the brain and then send that information to other glands so that you release the proper levels of hormones into your body. But again, endocrine system and nervous system are like best friends. They talk back and forth to one another, and they do so in what we call a feedback system. So what you're going to hear actually a little bit more of in the next lecture is that the brain, particularly the hypothalamus, sends lots of messages to the endocrine system, specifically to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland tells other glands, hey, you need to release this particular hormone. That hormone goes around within the body and does whatever it is that it's supposed to do. And then the body will then send messages back to the brain to let the brain know, how am I doing? Do I have the proper level of whatever in my system? Am I the right temperature? Do I have the right amount of sugar? Do I have the right amount of adrenaline? Whatever it is. And if it does, all right, then we're good. But if it doesn't, that brain will then say, hey, pituitary gland, we're still not right. You need to tell some other gland to release some other hormones so that we get back to the proper level. So it's constantly sort of this feedback loop so that your body is constantly able to change as necessary, but to stay at whatever level you need to do whatever activity it is that you do. So again, endocrine system and nervous system are best friends. They act somewhat similarly, but they also have a couple differences. So for example, the nervous system is what we call electrochemical because it's got the action potential, which is electrical, but it also has a chemical part, which is the neurotransmitters. The nervous system is much faster. So that whole, me screaming and letting go of the leash, that happened really, really fast. That endocrine system, which also kicked in with that adrenaline rush, is a little bit slower because the hormones and the time it takes to release the hormones and have them float around in the bloodstream takes a little bit longer. So your endocrine system is a little bit slower. Again, also using a chemical, but those chemicals are specifically called hormones. But again, both of them work together to produce molecules that act on various receptors, and they're interrelated. They're basically constantly talking back and forth to each other to keep your body at homeostasis. All right, that is the end of this first part. I hope you have a good rest of the semester. If you have any questions, let Professor Lynch know, and we will be happy to help you.